By October 1944, Japan's naval war was already lost in practical terms. What remained was the hope that loss could be transformed into delay, or failing that, into a single catastrophic blow that might still alter Allied momentum. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was conceived inside that narrowing space between reality and desperation. It was not a battle designed to win the war. It was designed to force the war to pause. The strategic context mattered more than the tactical details. The American advance across the Pacific had shattered Japan's outer defensive perimeter. Island by island, airfield by airfield, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps had compressed the battle space. Carrier aviation now dominated vast areas of ocean. Japanese shipbuilding could not keep pace with losses. Fuel shortages crippled training and operations. Most critically, Japan could no longer replace experienced pilots at anything approaching the rate they were being lost. Leyte was the moment when those pressures converged. The American decision to land on Leyte was not symbolic. It was operational. Leyte sat astride Japan's maritime lifeline to Southeast Asia. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, raw materials from Malaya, and resources from Indochina flowed north through waters that Leyte would now dominate. If the landing succeeded, Japan's economy and war effort would be severed from their last meaningful sources of fuel. For Japan, allowing that to happen uncontested meant accepting strategic suffocation. The Imperial Japanese Navy therefore committed to an operation that violated nearly every principle it once held. Rather than seeking a decisive fleet engagement under favorable conditions, it dispersed its remaining heavy units into multiple forces with divergent missions. The plan, later known as Shogo, was not elegant. It was brittle, but it was the only plan left. The logic was grimly simple. American carrier power was overwhelming. Japanese carrier aviation was no longer viable as a striking arm. Therefore, carriers would be used not as weapons, but as bait. Surface forces, battleships and cruisers still capable of inflicting massive damage, would attempt to penetrate into the landing area and destroy transports and support ships. If enough damage could be done quickly, the landings might fail. If they failed, the war might still be prolonged. This was not a plan built on confidence. It was built on sacrifice. The forces assembled reflected that reality. Japan committed almost everything it had left that could still float and fire. But what it could not commit was just as important: trained aircrews. Many Japanese pilots entering the battle had minimal experience. Training pipelines had collapsed under fuel shortages. The qualitative edge that had once defined Japanese naval aviation no longer existed. The American side entered Leyte from a position of strength, but not complacency. The landings themselves were massive and vulnerable. Hundreds of transports, escorts, and support vessels crowded confined waters. Protecting them required constant air cover, anti-submarine patrols, and surface screening. The U.S. Navy expected resistance. What it did not fully anticipate was the scale and fragmentation of the Japanese response. This fragmentation would define the battle. Japanese forces approached Leyte from multiple directions, through the Sibuyan Sea, through the Surigao Strait, and from the north. Each thrust was intended to interact with the others in time-sensitive ways. If any element failed or was delayed, the entire plan risked collapse. Coordination under such conditions required precision Japan no longer possessed. American command, by contrast, benefited from redundancy. Multiple carrier groups operated in overlapping zones. Intelligence, though imperfect, provided warning. Even when decisions were debated or mistaken, the margin for error was wide. Losses could be absorbed. Mistakes could be corrected. The opening phase of the battle immediately exposed the imbalance. Japanese movements were detected. Air attacks were launched. The Sibuyan Sea became a killing ground where Japanese surface ships were repeatedly struck by carrier aircraft. Each attack further reduced the striking power intended for the decisive blow. Yet even as Japanese losses mounted, the plan pressed forward. This persistence is sometimes misread as fanaticism. In reality, it reflected the absence of alternatives. Retreating would save ships, but concede the strategic objective entirely. Committing meant risking annihilation, but also preserving a chance, however small, to disrupt the invasion. This was the central tragedy of Leyte Gulf. Japan still possessed formidable ships, battleships with massive guns, cruisers capable of devastating fire. But it lacked the system to employ them effectively. Air cover was insufficient. Reconnaissance was limited. Coordination between forces was fragile. What remained was brute force applied without the scaffolding that made brute force decisive. American commanders, meanwhile, were fighting a different kind of battle. Their task was not to seek decisive confrontation at all costs, but to protect the landings and maintain operational tempo. Destroying the Japanese fleet was desirable, but secondary. The invasion's success did not require annihilation of the enemy, only that Japanese forces failed to disrupt it. This asymmetry shaped every decision that followed. As the battle unfolded, it would fracture into multiple engagements, each dramatic, each deadly, but all connected by the same underlying reality. Japan was expending assets it could never replace, while the United States was trading time and risk for irreversible advantage. Leyte Gulf is often described as the largest naval battle in history. That description captures scale, but not meaning. What made Leyte decisive was not the number of ships involved, but the nature of what was lost. Japan would lose more than vessels. It would lose trained pilots, fleet coherence, and the ability to contest the sea in any meaningful way. This was the last time the Imperial Japanese Navy attempted to fight as a fleet. What followed were fragments, isolated sorties, desperate measures, and a shift toward tactics that acknowledged the end of conventional naval warfare. The gamble at Leyte was therefore not about victory. It was about postponement. When it failed, postponement ended. Leyte Gulf did not unfold as a single, coherent clash. It shattered almost immediately into 4 interlinked battles, each shaped by geography, timing, and command decisions made under uncertainty. This fragmentation was not incidental. It was the product of a Japanese plan that required precise coordination at a moment when precision was no longer possible, and an American command structure resilient enough to absorb confusion without losing control. The Japanese plan depended on synchronized pressure from multiple directions. Surface forces would converge on the invasion area, while American carriers were drawn away. In theory, this would expose the vulnerable transports off Leyte. In practice, distance, detection, and attrition pulled the plan apart before its elements could combine. The first fracture occurred in the Sibuyan Sea. As Japanese center force transited toward Leyte, it was detected and subjected to repeated air attacks. American carrier aircraft struck relentlessly, focusing on slowing and damaging heavy ships before they could reach confined waters where their guns would matter most. The effect was cumulative. Even when ships were not sunk outright, damage reduced speed, disrupted formations, and forced evasive maneuvers that desynchronized the advance. These attacks achieved more than physical damage. They altered command decisions. Japanese commanders faced the dilemma of pressing forward with diminished strength or turning back to preserve what remained. Pressing on risked annihilation. Turning back conceded the objective. The choice to continue reflected the plan's underlying desperation, but it also ensured that the center force would arrive piecemeal and under strain. While this was unfolding, a second engagement took shape in the Surigao Strait. Here, Japanese Southern Force attempted to penetrate narrow waters guarded by American battleships and destroyers. This was one of the few moments in the war where surface combat resembled the classic engagements naval planners had imagined decades earlier. The geography forced confrontation. Maneuver was limited. Firepower mattered. The result was decisive. American forces, well-positioned and supported by radar and coordinated fire control, executed a textbook defense. Japanese ships were caught in a crossfire they could not escape. Losses were severe and irreversible. The Southern Force ceased to exist as a meaningful combat formation. This destruction had immediate consequences beyond the strait. The Japanese plan required pressure from multiple axes to overwhelm defenses and confuse response. With the Southern Force eliminated, the burden shifted entirely onto the Center Force. What was intended as convergence became isolation. The third engagement emerged to the north, where Japanese carriers approached not as a striking arm, but as a decoy. Their role was to draw American carrier groups away from Leyte. In this, they succeeded, partially. American commanders focused on the threat of carriers moved north to engage, temporarily leaving the invasion area with reduced carrier coverage. This decision has been debated ever since. It reflected the enduring weight of carrier doctrine. Carriers had defined naval combat throughout the Pacific War. Neutralizing them felt instinctively decisive. That instinct was not wrong in general, but at Leyte it interacted with a changing reality. Japanese carriers no longer represented the same level of threat they once had. Their air groups were thin, inexperienced, and incapable of sustained operations. Nevertheless, the movement north created a temporary vacuum. It was into this vacuum that the damaged but persistent Center Force advanced, slipping through gaps in coverage and approaching the invasion area unexpectedly. This led to the fourth engagement, off Samar, where lightly armed American escort carriers and destroyers faced Japanese heavy units. The battle off Samar is often remembered for its heroism and improbability. Small ships charged larger ones. Aircraft attacked with limited ordnance. Confusion reigned. But its significance lies in what it revealed about the state of Japanese naval power. Despite numerical and firepower superiority, the Center Force failed to exploit its opportunity fully. Command uncertainty, fear of air attack, and lack of reconnaissance inhibited decisive action. Japanese commanders did not know the full extent of American forces they faced. The threat of carrier strikes, real or perceived, loomed larger than the immediate tactical advantage. This hesitation proved fatal to the plan. The Center Force inflicted damage, but did not destroy the invasion fleet. It eventually withdrew, preserving some ships but conceding the strategic objective. The opportunity, once lost, could not be recreated. Across these four engagements, a pattern emerges. American forces responded flexibly to evolving threats. When mistakes occurred, they were mitigated by redundancy and initiative at lower levels. Japanese forces, by contrast, were bound tightly to a plan that assumed conditions no longer existed. Once the plan began to unravel, there was no adaptive framework to replace it. The fragmentation of Leyte Gulf accelerated Japanese losses. Instead of concentrating force, Japan fought 4 battles in sequence, each draining strength without achieving decisive effect. Each loss compounded the next. By the time the engagements concluded, the Imperial Japanese Navy had expended the last of its operational cohesion. For the Americans, the same fragmentation had the opposite effect. Fighting separate engagements allowed overwhelming force to be applied locally. Losses were absorbed. Threats were addressed in turn. The invasion proceeded uninterrupted. This asymmetry explains why Leyte Gulf's outcome was more decisive than its individual engagements might suggest. No single battle annihilated the Japanese fleet outright. What annihilated it was the inability to act as a fleet at all. Fragmentation also sealed the fate of Japanese naval aviation. Aircraft lost during the battle could not be replaced with trained crews. Carriers survived as hulls, but not as effective weapons. Surface ships survived as platforms, but without air cover or coordination. The fleet existed physically, but not functionally. By the end of the battle, Japan had lost the capacity to contest Allied control of the sea in any strategic sense. Future operations would rely on isolated sorties, coastal defense, and tactics that acknowledged conventional naval warfare was over. Leyte Gulf, therefore, was not just a defeat, it was a transition. It marked the end of fleet warfare for Japan and the beginning of a different, darker phase of the war at sea. The ships lost at Leyte Gulf were devastating, but they were not the most important losses Japan suffered. Steel could be rebuilt in theory. Crews could not. Leyte marked the moment when Japan's naval war ceased to be a contest of fleets and became a question of how long the remnants could endure without the people and systems required to fight effectively. The most critical loss was trained aircrew. By late 1944, Japan's naval aviation training system was already collapsing. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Accelerated programs pushed pilots into combat with minimal experience. Veteran instructors had been killed earlier in the war, removing the foundation needed to train replacements. Leyte did not create this crisis. It exposed and finalized it. Carrier aviation had once been Japan's decisive weapon. At Leyte, carriers still existed, but the air groups that made them dangerous did not. Pilots entering the battle lacked the experience to execute complex attacks, coordinate formations, or recover from disruption. Losses during Leyte wiped out much of what remained of Japan's trained naval aviators. There was no reserve to draw from. The pipeline was dry. This mattered more than the loss of carriers themselves. A carrier without trained pilots is a transport, not a weapon. After Leyte, Japanese carriers survived as hulls but ceased to function as effective instruments of power. They could no longer project force. They could only serve as decoys or symbols. Surface forces suffered a similar but less visible erosion. Battleships and cruisers that survived Leyte emerged with damaged crews, disrupted command structures, and diminished confidence. Gunnery officers, engineering specialists, and experienced bridge crews were lost alongside ships. Replacing such specialists required years of training. Japan no longer had time, fuel, or resources to provide. Equally damaging was the loss of fleet coherence. Before Leyte, Japan still attempted to operate its navy as an integrated force, coordinating carriers, surface ships, and submarines within a unified doctrine. Leyte shattered that possibility. The battle demonstrated that coordination under pressure, across distances, under air attack, with degraded communications, was no longer achievable. After Leyte, Japanese naval operations became fragmented by necessity. Ships operated in isolation or small groups. Large-scale maneuvers were avoided. The fleet no longer trained together because it could not move together safely or effectively. Without cohesion, doctrine ceased to matter. Fuel shortages compounded every loss. Even ships that survived Leyte could not be used freely. Sorties were rationed, training was curtailed. Commanders were forced to conserve fuel for hypothetical future engagements that would never materialize. This turned the fleet into a reserve that could not be committed without risking total depletion. This scarcity altered decision-making profoundly. Risk tolerance collapsed. Where earlier in the war, Japanese commanders had sought decisive engagement, after Leyte they became cautious, even defensive. The Navy shifted from seeking battle to avoiding it unless survival demanded otherwise. Initiative passed permanently to the Allies. The psychological impact on personnel was equally severe. Sailors and aviators understood that the battle had been a gamble and that it had failed. Confidence in leadership eroded. The sense of fighting toward a meaningful objective diminished. This did not mean discipline vanished, but it changed the character of resistance. Endurance replaced ambition. The American side experienced the inverse effect. Losses at Leyte were painful, but replaceable. Pilots lost could be replaced by trained crews. Ships damaged could be repaired or substituted. Most importantly, the U.S. Navy emerged with its systems intact. Training pipelines continued to function. Fleet coordination improved rather than degraded. This asymmetry defined the remainder of the naval war. After Leyte, the United States could escalate operations with confidence that losses would not undermine future capability. Japan could not. Every loss was permanent. Every engagement risked accelerating collapse. Leyte also marked the end of Japan's ability to contest sea control. Coastal waters remained dangerous. Isolated attacks could still inflict damage. But the open ocean, once Japan's domain, belonged decisively to the Allies. This allowed unimpeded movement of men, fuel, and equipment across the Pacific, accelerating operations on multiple fronts simultaneously. The consequences extended beyond naval engagements. With sea lanes cut, Japan's economy began to suffocate. Oil shortages worsened. Industrial output declined. Airfields lacked fuel. Ground forces fought with dwindling supplies. Leyte did not cause these effects alone, but it ensured they could not be reversed. This is why Leyte Gulf stands apart from earlier defeats. Midway had been catastrophic, but recovery was still conceivable. The Philippine Sea had destroyed carrier aviation, but the fleet remained intact. Leyte removed the final scaffolding that held Japan's naval war together. What followed was not recovery, but managed decline. The emergence of kamikaze tactics after Leyte reflected this shift. These attacks were not evidence of renewed strength. They were admissions that conventional naval aviation was no longer viable. When trained pilots and coordinated fleet operations disappear, desperation replaces doctrine. Leyte therefore represents a transition rather than an endpoint. It marked the end of Japan as a naval power capable of shaping events and the beginning of a phase where survival itself became the objective. The fleet still existed, but it no longer influenced outcomes. The Pacific War would continue for months, and fighting would remain fierce. But after Leyte, the strategic contest at sea was over. The outcome was no longer in question. Only the cost and duration remained. In the immediate aftermath of Leyte Gulf, a paradox confronted observers. Japan still possessed ships. Battleships remained afloat. Cruisers and destroyers limped back to ports. On paper, a fleet still existed. Yet operationally, the naval war was over. Leyte did not annihilate the Imperial Japanese Navy in a single stroke. It rendered it strategically irrelevant. This distinction explains why Leyte's importance is often misunderstood. Naval history is frequently told through ship losses and dramatic engagements. Leyte's true impact lies not in the tonnage sunk, but in what the surviving ships could no longer do. After Leyte, Japan could no longer assemble, coordinate, or sustain fleet operations capable of influencing the course of the war. The reasons were structural. First, command confidence collapsed. Leyte exposed the gap between doctrine and reality. Plans that relied on coordination across vast distances had failed catastrophically. Communication delays, detection by enemy air power, and the inability to synchronize movements under fire shattered faith in complex operations. After Leyte, Japanese naval planning became increasingly conservative, not because commanders lacked courage, but because they lacked belief that coordination was achievable. Second, operational tempo vanished. Even when ships survived, their ability to sortie was constrained by fuel scarcity and fear of air attack. Movement became risk management rather than maneuver. Fleets that cannot maneuver cannot impose dilemmas on an enemy. They can only react, and reaction favors the side with initiative. Third, air cover ceased to function as an enabling arm. Before Leyte, Japanese surface forces still hoped, however unrealistically, for periods of air protection. After Leyte, that hope evaporated. Carrier aviation was no longer a shield. Land-based aviation was fuel-starved and vulnerable. Without air cover, surface ships became targets rather than threats. This vulnerability altered behavior immediately. Japanese commanders avoided open waters during daylight. Training exercises were curtailed or canceled. Fleet concentrations were minimized to reduce detection. These measures preserved hulls but surrendered initiative. The fleet survived physically by withdrawing from relevance. Fourth, maintenance and repair capacity could not keep pace. Damaged ships required dry docks, skilled labor, and materials, all increasingly scarce. Even minor damage could sideline a vessel indefinitely. A fleet whose ships cannot be repaired promptly loses not just strength, but confidence and commitment. Contrast this with the American position. U.S. forces emerged from Leyte with intact command structures, robust logistics, and the ability to rotate units and crews. Mistakes made during the battle did not degrade systemic capability. On the contrary, lessons learned improved coordination and response in subsequent operations. This asymmetry turned the ocean into a one-sided domain. After Leyte, American naval power no longer needed to seek decisive battle. Control of sea lanes, protection of amphibious operations, and support for advancing armies could proceed with minimal interference. Japanese naval forces could threaten at the margins, but could not contest control. This is why Leyte marked the end of fleet warfare in the Pacific. Not because ships stopped fighting, but because the conditions that make fleet warfare meaningful disappeared. Large-scale engagements require coordination, air cover, logistics, and confidence in command. Leyte stripped Japan of all four. The shift toward kamikaze operations underscores this reality. These attacks did not represent a continuation of naval doctrine by other means. They represented its collapse. When pilots are no longer trained for sustained operations and fleets can no longer coordinate, desperation tactics fill the void. Kamikaze attacks inflicted damage, but they did not restore sea control or strategic initiative. Leyte also altered Allied expectations. After the battle, American planners recognized that Japan could no longer mount a coherent naval response to large, amphibious operations. This confidence accelerated planning for subsequent campaigns. The Philippines could be secured. Operations toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa could proceed. The war's tempo increased. This acceleration had cascading effects. Faster advances shortened timelines. Shorter timelines reduced Japan's ability to adapt or recover. Every month gained by the Allies compounded Japan's disadvantages in fuel, production, and training. Leyte thus functioned as a multiplier, not just a victory. Importantly, Leyte did not end resistance at sea. Submarines continued to operate. Coastal defenses remained dangerous. Isolated surface sorties occurred, but these actions lacked strategic coherence. They could harass but not shape outcomes. The difference between resistance and control defines Leyte's legacy. The fleet that returned from Leyte was a fleet in name only. It could still fight in isolated moments, but it could not plan, coordinate, or sustain a campaign. Its survival became an end in itself, detached from strategic purpose. This is why historians often note that after Leyte, Japan never again attempted a major fleet engagement. The absence of such attempts was not caution, it was acknowledgement. The Navy no longer possessed the means to fight as a system. Leyte therefore stands as a reminder that wars are decided by systems, not symbols. Ships are symbols. Fleets are systems. At Leyte, the symbols survived in part. The system did not. Midway is remembered as the battle that turned the Pacific War. Leyte Gulf is remembered as the largest naval battle in history. Neither description captures why Leyte mattered more than any engagement that came before it. Midway shocked Japan. Leyte exhausted it. After Leyte, Japan did not merely lose ships, it lost the capacity to fight a naval war at all. Midway destroyed carriers. Leyte destroyed replacement. That distinction defines the difference between a setback and an ending. After Midway, Japan still possessed a functioning system. Its training pipeline, though strained, still produced pilots. Its fleet doctrine, though damaged, remained coherent. Its command structure still believed decisive action was possible. The losses were catastrophic, but recovery, however unlikely, remained conceptually possible. After Leyte, that possibility vanished. Leyte Gulf occurred at the precise moment when Japan's margins had collapsed. Fuel shortages were chronic. Pilot training had been hollowed out. Industrial output could not compensate for losses. Leyte did not initiate these problems. It forced them into the open and consumed what little remained. This is why Leyte's outcome was irreversible. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered Leyte as a force gambling its last operational coherence. It emerged as a collection of surviving hulls without the people, fuel, doctrine, or confidence required to use them decisively. A fleet can lose ships and still fight. It cannot lose its system and recover. The losses at Leyte struck exactly where Japan was weakest. Experienced pilots were killed in numbers that training programs could not replace. Senior officers were lost. Coordination between fleet elements, already fragile, collapsed permanently. The battle exposed that Japan could no longer synchronize carrier aviation, surface action, and reconnaissance into a single operational plan. That exposure mattered more than any single sinking. From that point forward, Japanese naval actions were reactive rather than strategic. Sorties were limited. Engagements were avoided unless unavoidable. Fleet concentration, a prerequisite for decisive naval action, became impossible under Allied air dominance and fuel scarcity. The ocean ceased to be a contested space and became an Allied-controlled environment punctuated by Japanese resistance. The shift toward kamikaze operations after Leyte confirms this reality. These attacks were not an evolution of naval warfare. They were an admission that conventional naval power no longer existed. When pilots cannot be trained, fleets cannot coordinate, and air cover cannot be sustained, doctrine collapses into desperation. For the United States, Leyte had the opposite effect. The battle confirmed that American naval power had reached a self-sustaining state. Losses could be replaced. Crews could be trained. Command structures adapted under pressure rather than breaking. Even controversial decisions during the battle did not undermine the system's effectiveness. This asymmetry ended the strategic naval contest. After Leyte, American operations accelerated. Amphibious campaigns could be planned without fear of fleet interdiction. Sea lanes remained open. Logistics flowed uninterrupted. The Pacific became a highway rather than a battlefield. Japan could still fight fiercely on land, but it could no longer shape the war's direction at sea. This is why Leyte matters more than its scale suggests. It did not merely defeat the Japanese Navy. It removed the Navy as a meaningful actor in the war. What remained were fragments, dangerous, determined, but strategically irrelevant. The true measure of Leyte's importance lies in what did not happen afterward. There was no Japanese counteroffensive at sea, no attempt to regain control of supply lines, no renewed fleet doctrine. The silence of the ocean speaks louder than the explosions that preceded it. Leyte closed the book on Japan's naval war. The Pacific War would continue for months, and battles ahead would be brutal. But after Leyte, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan could resist. It could not recover. It could not reverse the tide. It could not replace what had been lost. That is why Leyte Gulf stands apart, not as a turning point, but as an ending point. The moment when Japan's last fleet gamble failed, and the sea itself became unwinnable. If you want fact-heavy, no-myth breakdowns of the battles that didn't just change wars, but made defeat irreversible, subscribe to WW2 Battles.